Yep.
David, welcome. How are
Hey,
you, sir?
how's it going, man?
Going well, going well. Appreciate you joining us. Well, let's kick this thing off, folks. Welcome to Defender Fridays. You know the name of the game, right? We come together once a week, have a chat with defenders in this space that are doing cool things. David's been on this show before, and the reason for that is David is constantly doing cool stuff in this space, and so he reached out, said, "Hey, I'd like to talk about building threat intel programs." And I think that's something that a lot of folks would benefit from because that's kind of one of those topics. That's one of those focus areas that I think is reserved for like the most sophisticated SOC teams, right? Like not everybody out there is geared for this because it's kind of like a specialized focus that requires some specific subject matter expertise. And so I was really excited, David, to get your thoughts on this topic. David, what are your thoughts on threat intel programs?
Yeah, so let's kind of talk about what threat intel is so that we can, more talk about what we're going to be building. So threat intel, a lot of people, especially myself, whenever I was a noob, thought things like just generic data feeds like IP addresses that were like, hey, here's a malicious IP address feed list, like the SANS ISC stuff that was like threat intel. But all that is just data. So what the threat intel piece comes in is where you're adding context and providing context. And then there's really three different layers of threat intelligence. The one that we're probably going to mostly talk about today is going to be at the tactical level. But you're going to have stuff that's tactical level, which is going to be what your analysts are going to be mostly dealing with, your detection engineers. This is going to be more directly related to like what detections you're going to be building based off the intel. Then you're going to have things like operational level stuff. This is pretty tied into a lot of the tactical stuff, but this is going to be more like what your SOC managers and maybe directors might be doing. So this could be things like, hey, I need to reprioritize or change processes or, maybe do something different at an operational level based on the intelligence that I have. And then, of course, there's the strategic stuff. So this is going to be your C-suite. Like maybe I'm going to reprioritize certain like focuses or implementations of certain things based on the data that we get. So good examples could be of like a strategic type of intelligence. Maybe, we find out something like a particular attacker is now targeting our vertical. So like, let's say I'm a big bank, for example, and then um, the competitor has a bank like a phishing page that stood up that's something pretty obvious, just something like sso-thebank.com or something that I just know that's not theirs for whatever reason. It's typically pretty obvious to tell, but um, I might see that, and then that could be a tip off. Like, what was the group? The Com was, had a lot of the same TTP, so they would go through, and I knew if I saw a certain domain pattern that's probably being targeted by a certain adversary, and then I know that adversary does certain things. So at the time, they might be doing things like targeting ESXi servers for ransomware. Maybe I don't have my ESXi logs going to my SIM, and now that could be something I, as a CISO, say, hey, I want to prioritize this, and let's make sure that we have some of this visibility that we need. So that's just the kind of different levels and pieces of kind of intel, the very basics.
So basically, it sounds like you're talking about kind of using a more threat model based approach, right? Instead of just like the kitchen sink of Intel saying, what are our key concerns, and then focusing our efforts there from an Intel perspective.
Yep.
So, and then you also talked about something else, kind of Intel information sharing, right? Like, hey, we know we exist in this particular vertical, so maybe we should focus our consumption efforts on things that are relevant to that vertical. I mean, do you have any kind of advice or thoughts? Like, how does an org that today is probably barely operationalizing Intel at all, how do they start to move in that direction?
Yeah, so let's talk about that. I'm going to step a little bit further away from there. So, whenever I, as an organization, and maybe wanting to start an Intel team, I want to define what that Intel team is going to get me. A lot of times, especially early on, that's going to be detection related, and those really go hand in hand. So, smaller Intel teams might, the detection engineers might also be the people that are generating the threat intelligence. And so it really will depend on your organization on who does what, but typically What I really recommend is before you do any paid products, is you develop the processes and procedures on like the open source stuff. So just taking these blog posts and different things. So if you look in the Lima Charlie Intel Slack, I posted the Palo Alto Networks Unit 42 article about some new Chinese activity. I forget the exact one, but basically it listed a whole bunch of new techniques that I hadn't seen before. So a good example of what like a basic process might be for tactical intelligence is, maybe I'm a detection engineer and then I'm also, trying to fill in that intel gap until we get big enough to have our own intel team. I could do things like, hey, I'm going to take this blog. I'm going to go through and build detections based on the content that I see in there. I might go through and try and find all of the tools, something that you might see that I've done in the Intel Slack. So I've provided a lot of those for you. But going through and generating a lot of that stuff. Now, uh, depending on your team size, your threat intel team might be separated from the detection team. So it could be at a certain point as a threat intel analyst, you're the one that's going out there pulling those, tweets with, threat actors doing this attack chain or maybe the blog post from XYZ company. You're pulling those in, you're tracking those and processing them. Processing them basically means going through, reading them, and then looking for like what are they actually doing and then comparing that to what you're doing internally in terms of like detection. So like, maybe they're using some new VPN, like the Soft Ether VPN in the example that I was talking about earlier. That wasn't one that I was aware of, but it was an open source VPN. I could then go through and, build tools or detections based on those tools. So that's a good start. And then one other thing, so you asked about like the verticals and industry sharing. So where that can really help whenever you're not paying for things is if you're getting involved with ISACs, which can be really helpful. There's also just kind of, I guess you could say, unofficial, just hey, just reaching out to like competitors and their security teams, and then having that kind of just discussion. And then of course, and I'll see if I can post one of these in the Slack channel. There's also a few like spreadsheets that are maintained by just the community that have a list of like different attackers and what verticals they are typically target, and then yeah, and then the different like names that they might be called in the industry, so that can give you a good kind of starting point. And then one other quick thing before go on to like another question or something is it's important also like while you're generating and using those that external threat intelligence, that you also use your internal threat intelligence. This is something that a lot of people don't actually go back and do particularly well. So in an incident response process, you have your lessons learned, but it's also important to go back and say, hey, what are the patterns and the different actors that have been targeting me specifically? What malware families have I been seeing? And then prioritizing those as I need to stay on top of this more specifically and, make sure I know what they're doing.
And you're preaching to the choir. So it's such a simple thing, but it's surprisingly absent in a lot of SOC tooling. The ability to draw correlations over time of casework, right? Like, sure, your SIEM does correlation, your SOAR hopefully does correlation, but the case management tool where your SOC analysts are inputting their notes, their findings, their IOCs, all that stuff, day after day after day after day, is that thing drawing correlations to help you identify campaigns, and trends. Because exactly to your point, right? Like I think part of the natural evolution of kind of starting to be a more intel-based security operations team is being able to draw those connections to say, wait a minute, yeah, sure, we've worked, 115 phishing cases this month. Well, was that truly 115 individual unrelated phishing cases? Or were 10 of those actually linked through some common indicator to kind of elevate as a no, that's a campaign. That's some group that is like persistently aiming at your organization. And if you don't connect those dots and you're treating them like your everyday run of the mill, another phishing alert, another phishing alert, then you're going to miss the day that they finally succeed, they get in. And an adversary that's that dedicated to targeting your organization, that's the one that's going to do the most damage when they finally succeed, right? They're not trying to get your PayPal password. No, they're trying to get a foothold in your organization. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a simple thing. But a lot of teams, if you're tossing, your casework into SharePoint or OneNote, you're not getting this level of correlation, right? You need a proper kind of case management tool that will draw those connections for you. And again, a lot of sophisticated SOC teams, they're doing this in spades, right? And SOAR platforms generally well tuned for this. But there's a lot of teams that just aren't there yet, right? And I think to your point, right? That's one of the easiest ways to operationalize your own internal intel. Before you even flip the switch to open the fire hose of, oh, let's subscribe to all the threat intel feeds, start with what you already have based on what you've already seen. How well are you using that intel, right?
Yep. Yeah, yeah. And at Soteria, so one of the things that we wrote forever ago was a, detection as code kind of white paper. That was a real, actually full on like process, and everything that we've talked about right now is all people processes. You don't have to buy anything to start a threat intel program. You could basically take the process that we used where essentially, hey, I found this blog post. I'm going to open up a Git commit and then say, hey, or however you want to do it, that maybe says, I want to track like all of this data. Here's what it is. And then, start tracking that in like Git, for example. So it's all people process driven. And yeah, so it's something just to really keep in mind on that front. And but yeah, to your point. And
And
go
oh,
ahead.
sorry. Oh, well, it's just to kind of comment also on what Eric was saying before. I saw some teams say, "Oh, I got this probably malware thing. Let's run it on VirusTotal. Oh, no it on VirusTotal. I'm totally fine." Or the same thing. Oh, the IP is not malicious. It's not on VirusTotal, or it's not on feed XYZ, so I'm safe. And then what do you think happens 2 or 3 days after that?
Yeah.
Yep.
A big ransom note, right?
I was just talking about this the day before yesterday in my Velociraptor course. When I search a hash on VirusTotal, if I don't get a hit, that is in many ways more alarming to me than if I did get a hit that was red all the way down, right? Because it's something new, it's something novel. VirusTotal hasn't seen it, and folks, I'm telling you right now, VirusTotal has seen everything. You could find a random JPEG on your hard drive, hash it, check the hash on VirusTotal, it's been seen. So like, yeah. Yeah, there's definitely nuances in saying just because something is not in a threat feed does not mean it's benign. Sometimes it's the absence of this intel existing that might actually elevate, your sort of TLP around the finding, because it's like, okay, well, I'm obviously not searching this hash for no reason, right? I've seen it. Maybe it was in an EDR alert. Maybe it was in, some sort of anomalous sort of activity. So I'm already suspicious of it. I check it against OSINT and it's nowhere to be found. Well, it's either the most rare thing in the world or it is a handcrafted, artesian, piece of malware that was generated yesterday targeting my organization. So that's something to consider.
Yeah, so I also just stepping back one more time, just walking people through. So if you're kind of following along at this point, we're basically at a point if you're trying to build a program where you now have a process where you're ingesting this intel, taking these blog posts, you're now tracking it in some manner. So like maybe you follow that detection as code process, and you're now basically taking that intel and tying it to your detections, and you're starting to get a good active intel program by going through and then reviewing your historical stuff. That's helping you prioritize some of the like what is going to be the most important. You're going to find a lot of the just more commodities malware stuff is probably going to be what's hitting you the most. But even just knowing kind of what those are like I might be more vigilant on saying, hey, I need to check every day for new blog posts on Google for this family or something. That's a kind of getting you to your first point. I would call this more of like a passive like intel program.
Mm.
Once you kind of get that to where you're now like at this point where you've got these processes down, I think that's a good point to where a good point to start building like some more active type stuff. So like if you want to go ahead and one of the things that I super recommend most organizations do is track the domain registrations and TLS certificate transparency logs for things that are related to their domain. So if you don't want to do this yourself, I had a lot of experience with this at Soteria. They have I think they call it DNS Watch now. But basically the idea is you want to monitor like domains that could be similar to yours. Maybe they have certain keywords. Look for new registrations, and that will make such a big difference on your basically your security program going from more reactive to a more proactive. So as soon as something gets registered, I can go through, check with my IT team, say, hey, is this us? If not, it's blocked before it ever gets a phishing page, stood out. It really starts making you proactive, and it's important. So certificate transparency logs are really easy to get for free. And I actually just had this come up recently, but it's important to remember um, you don't have to use TLS certificates with a domain to host malware. So for example, I as an attacker may not ever generate a certificate with my domain, and that would never show up in the TLS log. So it's good to ideally have both the domains as they're being generated and the certificate logs. And you can get that domain list from ICANN and some other places, but I'll warn you, if you sign up, it's a lot of domains and it's not easy. So it could be worth getting like a service, and there's a bunch of them out there. So, but that's one of the good first things to do. And then one more quick thing, a secret I'll also recommend is not only monitor your domains if you can, but like if you have other brands, so like maybe I'm a bank A, I might monitor the domain names of other banks to see if they get targeted. So if I see that they start getting targeted, I can reach out to their security team and say, hey, I just saw this get registered. I see you already have like SSO dot something registered. This looks like it's probably weird. If this isn't you, just hear it as a FYI. But here, maybe I now know, like going back to the com as an example, where it says it was like, hey, they're using this domain pattern. I might be able to say, okay, this is likely the com. This is the same infrastructure hosting that they typically use. And then now I might prioritize and say, hey, I'm getting targeted, or at least the comment might be targeting my industry vertical. I know they're at least targeting a competitor. I need to be prepared for them targeting me, and then potentially even work directly together to see what's happening and how you can share information.
David, I'm curious, what are your thoughts on ISACs these days? Because I have my own opinions, but I'd like to kind of hear what you would say about them.
Some are better than others.
Yeah, that
There are some that are really wonderful. I think the financial ISACs and the retail ISACs are probably pretty good, and then others are almost dead or just have really low quality stuff. So um, just remember and realize you don't have to necessarily depend on an ISAC organization to reach out to a company. Looking on LinkedIn, just building those, kind of natural relationships. Uh, don't feel tied to them is kind of more what I'm getting at.
Yeah, got it. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the I think the tricky things about starting to try to participate in any sort of intel sharing community, whether it's an ISAC or you're just subscribing to the IC3, announcements and notifications, right? Is how they disseminate intel, the confidence, reliability of that intel. And then Ian in chat made a good point too, that so often we consume intel that has an extremely short shelf life, right? And so should I be using a massive lookup of IP addresses when in reality those IPs were hot intel for maybe about a day or two, but but we used them for years to come in a lookup table, and now I've got a source of false positives because IPs that once upon a time were used in some sort of malware campaign or belong to a CDN or whatever are just no longer valuable. And so, I think orgs really got to be picky when it comes to sort of who they're sharing intel with, and also the confidence of that intel. Like the right answer is not consume the kitchen sink here, right?
Mhm.
That's how you end up right back into the infinite backlog of SOC alerts that no one can really make sense of.
Yep. And I'll tell you, a lot of the intel behind the scenes is really just taking other blog posts, tweets, that kind of stuff, and just building that out in your own program, maybe using your own data to expand upon it. And then, if you're like a big provider or a security company, for example, maybe you're tracking your own campaigns that aren't public, and you just have other stuff related to that. So um, don't feel like just because you're not paying for Intel that it's not going to be good or quality. And then one of the big things, like if you're going to pay for a feed, make sure you understand what you're getting. So like whenever you're paying for threat intel, a lot of the stuff, what you'll get nowadays is going to be something like a report, and it'll come with things like Sigma rules, Yara rules, and Suricata rules that you can then tie back to that contextual data, kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier. And then um, if you are doing the kind of process we walked through earlier, where you're ingesting and tracking intel, processing those intel, you're basically doing that yourself if you don't want to pay for it. Does that make sense? So like if I'm paying for Intel to have, Intel 471 or CrowdStrike or Mandiant, say, hey, this is what we're seeing. We generated these YAR rules and stuff based off that. Um, Here you go. And then if you get a detection, now you can go read what that detection's about, what it's tied to intel wise, just like if you did it yourself.
But a different spin on your point there. Don't think that because you're not paying for the feed that it's not good. Well, I'll also say don't think that because you are paying for the feed that it is good. Meaning it's not gonna. There's no guarantees in any of this. And then to tie in with the link Scooby just posted, tweet feed. So I remember some years ago working a case for an internal investigation we were doing, where it was a very conventional Trojan that had been on a system for some time, and there were threat feeds in the being subscribed to that were bolted onto the seam, and I'm not going to name products, but top tier IDS IPS products. And when we were digging into it, we found open source threat intel on Twitter that had been, or it was over a year old at this point, right? Like IP address, domain name, all of it that was identical to what we were seeing. And you scratch your head for a minute and you're like, how did all of our fancy feeds and our fancy products, with threat intel integration miss this thing that's been on Twitter for over a year? Sometimes the best intel is free, but it's the impossible act of, well, how do I consume everything that's hitting Twitter? Like
Yep, and that's where a threat intel person comes in. That becomes their role to then start going out, seeking out that kind of information, maintaining, your detection content, making sure it's tied to like some sort of contextual data, and then ensuring that you're going back through your own data and then having like that historical prioritization. And once you start getting that process and you find that becoming like a full-time job, now you've got your first threat intel analyst as a role.
indeed. So David, let's talk real tools real quick as we've got a couple more minutes. For somebody that's trying to kind of step up their game in the Intel space, maybe they don't have a full dedicated team that's doing Intel, but they'd like to kind of sort of evolve their maturity. Are there a couple tools or resources that you say these are the ones that I would start with?
Yeah, so if you can't do it yourself, I would say start with some sort of brand monitoring. That's going to monitor for like new domains, your new certificates and stuff. And what those services should typically be doing for you is finding any new domain registrations, any new like certificate stuff that looks malicious, and ideally going through and making sure and doing some vetting before it's ever sent to you. Some people just want the fire hose of data, but something to kind of keep in mind. That's probably the piece that I would really start with. And then once you have something along those lines, it really kind of I would say depends on what you need as an organization. I think a lot of organizations would benefit from tools like a virus total, because then you can go through, write YAR detections, and then use the like one of the most my favorite features is the ability to run YAR rules against their freeware corpus before, or a goodware corpus rather, so I can make sure it's it's not hitting false positives before pushing it to prod. But even just being able to set some of those to maybe proactively look for infrastructure that might be, I don't know, just maybe malware samples of families that might be getting submitted that have low detections, or some other kind of thing. Those are a lot of my kind of go-tos to get
I'll
started.
share I'll share one that I'm a big fan of. So I know most, if not all of you, are familiar with gray noise. But
Oh yeah, yeah,
what you may not know is they expose a feature for free. It's part of their community offering where you can go in and basically set up dynamic lists. And so I can run a query in gray noise for instance, folks, or IP addresses that are observed exploiting CVE, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then it basically publishes a list of those IPs that I can immediately subscribe to at like my firewall level, right? I can set it up as a dynamic block list in my firewall, and it's pulling that feed from Gray Noise directly for free 99, right? Like I think that is so freaking cool. And the Gray Noise intel is really solid because it's not user contributed stuff. It's based on what the sensors are seeing, so you know that it's actionable. And so
yeah.
I mean, and there's plenty of others like this, but Gray Noise is doing some pretty cool stuff there.
Yeah, and just one other quick thing. I know we're running up on time, but you mentioned something I just want to hit on too. A lot of indicators can have those short-lived shelf lives. One of the great things that Lima Charlie does is give you that year of telemetry, so you can go back and like by the time some of these indicators hit the reports that then become public, they're probably no longer in use. That's not always the case, but they're probably not. Going back and doing a retroactive search for them is probably going to be more effective in most cases than doing a detection. I say do both if you can, and then start getting rid of the indicators once they start causing performance problems or false positive issues. But that's another thing. And then one other kind of quick thing that I wanted to mention is I've been thinking, if you're a part of an MSSP that uses Lima Charlie, of throwing together a quote unquote Lima Charlie alliance. So if you have any interest in that, reach out to myself or maybe Charlton, and we'll kind of get in touch and put something together. I'll be out most of next week, but I'll probably start putting some ideas around and start trying to get something official going the week after.
MSSP ISAC. I love it, man. I think that's exactly something. It's something that a lot of orgs would want to participate in. All right, folks. Well, we're a minute over. So, David, thank you so much for joining us. Everyone else, great to see you. See you same time, same place next week. Have a great rest of your Friday.
Yeah, see y'all.